The first thing everyone noticed about him was not his strength, though it was unmistakable in the way his shoulders filled out the coarse linen shirt, or the way he lifted burdens without complaint. It was not even his height, which made him stand half a head above most men on the plantation. It was his face, calm, symmetrical, almost unsettling in its quiet dignity. In a place built on breaking people, he looked unbroken. They called him many things behind his back. Pretty, exotic, unnatural, but never his name. Names gave men shape, and shape suggested humanity. On the plantation, that was a dangerous thing to acknowledge. He had been brought to the estate late in the summer, when the heat lay thick over the land and the air smelled of ripening cotton and old rot. The overseer assigned him first to the fields, as was custom, but it did not last. Within days, whispers began to drift toward the big house, passed from servant to servant, carried by glances that lingered too long. "There's a new one," someone said in the kitchen. "The tall one," said another. "The handsome one." By the end of the week, the mistress of the house had asked to see him. He stood in the parlor that morning with his hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes lowered just enough to be respectful, but not so much as to appear afraid. The room smelled of perfume and polished wood. Heavy curtains filtered the sunlight into a golden haze, making the carved furniture glow like relics in a shrine. 3 white women sat before him. They were dressed in pale colors, cream, soft blue, faded rose, their gowns cinched tight at the waist, sleeves puffed just enough to signal refinement. Their hair was arranged with care, curls pinned and smoothed, not a strand out of place. They looked bored, as women with too much time often did. The mistress was the first to speak. "So this is him," she said lightly, as though commenting on a new piece of furniture. "The one everyone is talking about." Her sister leaned forward, studying him openly, eyes tracing his face without shame. "He doesn't look like the others," she said. "There's something composed about him." The youngest laughed softly. "Or arrogant," she added. "I don't like that look." He said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was safer than explanation. Words could be twisted. Silence, at least, gave them less to work with. "Stand closer," the mistress ordered. He obeyed, stepping forward until he stood just within their circle of scrutiny. The air felt heavier there, thick with expectation. He kept his expression neutral, but inside every instinct warned him that this attention was not a gift. It never was. "You'll be working near the house now," the mistress said. "We need someone presentable." The word landed heavily. Presentable. Not skilled, not capable, decorative. That afternoon he was removed from the fields and given tasks that kept him close, carrying trays, cleaning rooms that were already spotless, standing silently while conversations drifted over him as if he were another chair in the corner. The other enslaved people noticed the change immediately. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with fear. A few with envy, mistaking proximity to comfort for safety. He knew better. The big house was not safer. It was sharper. Cruelty there did not shout. It smiled. At first the women were polite. Too polite. They asked him questions not meant to be answered. Where was he from? Did he understand English well? Had anyone ever told him he was handsome? Their laughter followed each question, light and musical, but edged with something colder, when he did not respond the way they wanted, did not blush, did not flinch, did not bow his head low enough. They exchanged glances. "Does he think he's better than us?" one asked, not bothering to lower her voice. "I think he needs reminding of his place," said another, smiling. The reminders began subtly. Impossible instructions delivered sweetly. "Clean this room again. It still smells of dust. Stand there. No, not there. There. Bring the tea. Why is it not hot enough?" Each correction carried the threat of punishment. Unspoken but understood. One evening, as dusk settled over the plantation, the youngest woman called him into a sitting room lit only by an oil lamp. Shadows climbed the walls like restless spirits. She circled him slowly, her footsteps soft against the rug. "You don't say much," she said. "That can be taken as disrespect." "I mean no disrespect," he replied carefully, choosing each word as though it might cut him. She tilted her head. "Then you should look more grateful. Grateful for being noticed, for being watched." He lowered his eyes further, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation settle in his chest. It was not pain that hurt the most. It was the deliberate attempt to erase him, to turn his restraint into an offense. By the end of the first month, the attention had shifted from curiosity to possession. The women spoke of him as though he were theirs alone, bickering over whose tasks he completed, whose summons he answered first. They invented slights where none existed, a glance held too long, a pause before obedience. Each imagined flaw became an excuse. He rolled his eyes at me, one claimed. He sighed when I spoke, said another. He thinks himself above correction. The overseer never questioned their accusations. Punishment was easier than truth. He learned to endure in silence, to carry his suffering inward where it could not be seen. At night, in the narrow space allotted to him, he lay awake replaying each interaction, each look, searching for mistakes that might be corrected. But there were none. His beauty was the crime, his composure the insult. What they wanted was not obedience alone, it was submission of the spirit, and that, despite everything, they could not yet take. He did not know then that this was only the beginning, that the smiles would sharpen, that jealousy would rot into cruelty, that his existence in their orbit would become a kind of unspoken war. But as he stood one morning on the steps of the big house, the women watching from behind lace curtains, their eyes bright with interest and resentment, he felt it settle into his bones. On this plantation, being seen was more dangerous than being invisible, and he had been seen. The days that followed did not bring relief. If anything, the attention he had drawn only sharpened, like a blade honed slowly and deliberately. Where before the women had watched him with curiosity, now they observed him with calculation. Each look carried intent. Each summons was measured, as though part of a game whose rules he had never been told. He noticed it first in the way they spoke his presence into existence. A bell rang when he was needed, sharp and sudden, regardless of the hour. Sometimes it was rung twice in quick succession, not out of urgency, but impatience. When he arrived, breath steady, posture respectful, they often stared at him in silence before speaking, as if testing how long they could make him stand there without explanation. "Did you hear the bell immediately?" one asked once, eyes narrowed. "Yes, ma'am." "And yet you took your time." He wanted to say that he had come as quickly as his legs allowed, that the distance from the far side of the house was not small, but explanations were dangerous things. They could be twisted into defiance. "I apologize," he said instead. They exchanged satisfied glances. An apology, even an undeserved one, was a small victory. Soon the polite cruelty of words began to press harder. Tasks were layered atop one another, timed so that completion of one meant failure at another. He was told to polish silver that had already been polished, then scolded for neglecting duties he had never been assigned. When he asked for clarification once, just once, the room fell silent. "You question us?" the mistress said softly. "No, ma'am." "Then don't speak unless spoken to." After that, silence became his shield. He worked with precision, his movements careful, his expression unreadable, but his composure seemed to enrage them more than mistakes ever could. They wanted to see him crack. They wanted proof that he was aware of their power. One afternoon, as rain drummed steadily against the windows, they called him into the sewing room. Fabric lay strewn everywhere, bright and expensive, the air thick with perfume and damp wool. The women sat close together, their voices low. "Stand there," the youngest said, pointing to a spot near the wall. He stood. They spoke about him as if he were not there, about his posture, about the way he carried himself, about how men like him needed to be reminded that their place was beneath notice, not at its center. "He walks as though he belongs here," one said. "That can be corrected," another replied. When they finally addressed him directly, it was with accusation. "You think yourself special," the mistress said. "People notice that." "I don't, ma'am." A lie, perhaps, but not in the way they meant. He did not think himself special, only human, and that, he was learning, was the greater offense. Punishment followed swiftly and without ceremony. Extra hours of labor, food withheld under the excuse of forgetfulness, public reprimands delivered with calm smiles. The overseer's presence was a looming threat, rarely needed, because fear did most of the work on its own. The other enslaved people watched from a distance. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to be associated with attention that might spread. Others whispered warnings when they could. "They don't like that you don't beg," an older woman told him quietly one night. "They don't like that you still stand straight," said another. He nodded, storing the information carefully. Knowledge, he had learned, was its own kind of resistance. As weeks passed, jealousy took root among the women like a sickness. Each believed the others were receiving more of his attention, more of his obedience, more of whatever it was they wanted from him. They competed not for his favor, but for dominance over him. One accused him of smiling at her sister. Another claimed he ignored her orders deliberately. The accusations contradicted each other, but truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the result. "You've made enemies without meaning to," the overseer told him once, almost kindly. "That's a dangerous talent." The nights grew heavier. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the anticipation of the next day's demands. He learned to read footsteps in the hallway, to recognize which door opening meant trouble and which merely meant more work. The house itself seemed to conspire against him, its long corridors echoing with expectations he could never fulfill. Yet beneath the weight of exhaustion and humiliation, something unexpected began to form: clarity. He started to see patterns: who spoke first in the morning, who deferred to whom in private, which accusations were most readily believed and which were dismissed. He noticed how the women's authority relied not just on power, but on appearances, on maintaining a sense of control and propriety that could not withstand scrutiny. They feared exposure almost as much as they enjoyed dominance. One evening, as he carried a tray through the parlor, he caught a glimpse of himself in a mirror. For a brief moment he barely recognized the man staring back. His face was thinner, eyes darker with fatigue, but there was something else there too, a steadiness that had not been there before. They could hurt his body, they could humiliate him, but they could not fully reach the place where he now stood watching, learning, waiting. The cruelty escalated when they realized he was not breaking fast enough. "You've grown cold," the youngest said one morning, her voice sharp, almost defiant. "I follow every order," he replied quietly, without enthusiasm. Enthusiasm. They wanted gratitude for cruelty, joy in submission. When he failed to produce it, their disappointment curdled into anger. They sought new ways to remind him of his vulnerability. New accusations, new lies. Each one pushed him closer to a line he could feel but not yet see clearly. Still, he endured, because somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear, a truth had settled into him as solid as bone. Obedience would never save him. Appeasement would never satisfy them. The only way out of their grasp lay beyond the plantation's fences, beyond their reach and their names, and though he did not yet know how or when, he knew this: every smile they wore hid a weakness, and one day he would no longer be standing where they told him to stand. The tension that had once lived quietly beneath glances and polite cruelty no longer bothered to hide itself. It crept openly through the halls of the big house, settling into corners, hanging in the air like dampness before a storm. He felt it the moment he stepped inside each morning, the way conversations stopped when he entered, the way eyes followed him not with curiosity now, but with something sharper. Jealousy had taken root, and it was no longer subtle. It began with small contradictions. One woman would give him an order in the morning, only for another to scold him for carrying it out by afternoon. He was told to stay near the house, then punished for lingering. He was sent away, then accused of avoiding his duties. No choice led to safety. Every path ended the same way. "You enjoy confusing us," the mistress said once, her voice calm, her smile thin. "No, ma'am," he answered. "Then why does it seem we can't agree on you?" He did not respond. He had learned that silence frustrated them, but speech armed them. Either way, the outcome rarely changed. The rivalry between the women sharpened with each passing day. They watched each other as closely as they watched him, measuring glances, counting interactions. If one summoned him too often, another would soon invent a reason to punish him. If he was seen carrying something for one, whispers would follow before the hour was out. "You think he favors you," one snapped at another late one afternoon, unaware that he stood just beyond the doorway listening. "He does what he's told," came the reply. "Perhaps that offends you." Laughter followed, brittle and false. He understood then that he had become more than a target. He was a mirror, reflecting their insecurities back at them. His presence unsettled them, not because of what he did, but because of what they saw in themselves when they looked at him. Desire tangled with resentment, power undercut by dependence on it. They could command him, but they could not command each other. And that failure needed an outlet. It became common for him to be accused publicly now, called out in front of servants and workers alike. The humiliation was intentional. They wanted to remind him and everyone else of his place. "You were slow," one declared loudly as he passed through the hall. "You didn't answer when spoken to," another added. "He looked at me improperly," said a third, her voice carrying. Each accusation contradicted the last, but contradiction no longer mattered. The overseer accepted their words without question. Punishment followed swiftly, mechanically, as though routine were its own justification. The other enslaved people avoided his eyes. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Attention was contagious, and no one wanted to catch it. At night he lay awake replaying the days, not to find fault in himself, but to map their behavior. He noted how accusations clustered after certain conversations, how cruelty spiked when the women disagreed among themselves. He learned that their unity was fragile, that it required constant reinforcement through shared targets. He was that target. One evening he was summoned to the parlor after supper. The lamps were lit low, casting long shadows across the walls. The women sat apart from one another, tension visible even in the way they held their hands. "Stand there," the mistress said. He did. "You've caused trouble," she continued. "I haven't meant to." She raised a hand sharply. "Don't." Silence fell heavy between them. "You think you're clever," said the sister, leaning forward. "Watching us, learning." He felt his chest tighten, but he kept his face still. "I only do my work." "Don't insult us," the youngest snapped. "We see the way you listen, the way you remember." A dangerous thing had happened. They had noticed his awareness. For a moment he thought this might be the end of careful games, that the cruelty would finally spill into something uncontrolled. But instead the mistress smiled. "Perhaps we've been too lenient," she said softly. "Perhaps we've allowed you to forget yourself." What followed was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no spectacle, only a quiet tightening of rules, restrictions layered atop restrictions, movement monitored, tasks doubled, any small misstep treated as deliberate defiance. It was, he realized, a calculated attempt to wear him down. But something in him had shifted already. Where once fear had guided his choices, now understanding did. He began to see how predictable they were, how their cruelty followed emotional patterns rather than logic. When one felt ignored, punishment followed. When another felt insecure, accusations multiplied. They were not united in purpose, only in possession, and possession bred fear. He saw it in the way they reacted to rumors, in the way they snapped when others asked questions, in how quickly they silenced servants who lingered too long or listened too closely. Their authority depended on secrecy, on the assumption that no one was watching closely enough to connect the dots. He was watching. One afternoon, as he scrubbed the floor near the stairs, he overheard raised voices above him. "You're too obvious," one hissed. "You're the one who can't control yourself," another shot back. The words were sharp, panicked. For the first time he allowed himself a thought he had never dared before. They were afraid, not of him exactly, but of what might happen if their games were seen for what they were. If their rivalry, their cruelty, their loss of control became visible beyond the walls of the big house. That fear did not soften them. It hardened them. The next accusation was the worst yet, one that could not be disproven, one designed to strip him not just of dignity, but of credibility. "He threatened me," the youngest claimed, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. The room froze. He felt the weight of the lie immediately, heavy and suffocating. "I did no such thing," he said, unable to stop himself this time. His denial only sealed it. The overseer's expression darkened. The women watched him closely, searching his face not for truth but for weakness. Punishment followed, harsher than before, designed not just to hurt but to warn. Afterward, as he sat alone in the quiet dark, pain pulsing through him, something inside finally hardened into certainty. They would never stop. No amount of obedience would satisfy them. No silence would protect him. As long as he remained within reach, he would be used to soothe their rivalries, their boredom, their fear of themselves. Survival, he realized, would not come from enduring quietly forever. It would come from outlasting them, from learning when to bend, when to disappear, when to let their own jealousy tear at the fragile structure holding them together. As dawn crept in through the narrow opening of his quarters, he pushed himself upright, ignoring the ache in his body. Outside, the plantation stirred awake, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place. He was no longer simply enduring, he was preparing. The change did not announce itself all at once. It arrived quietly, settling into him the way resolve does, without drama, without witnesses. Where fear had once tightened his chest at every summons, now there was a steady calm. Not peace exactly, but focus. He moved through the days with the same obedience as before, yet something in his eyes had altered, grown watchful in a way that no longer begged for approval. The women sensed it before they could name it. They mistook his composure for defiance. "You're slower," the mistress remarked one morning, her tone light but sharp beneath the surface. "I'm careful," he replied. "Careful," she echoed, as though tasting the word. "Be careful you don't forget yourself." He bowed his head just enough. He had learned that the smallest gestures could either soothe or inflame them. This one bought him a few hours of quiet. The plantation moved on routines older than memory, and within those routines he found space to observe. He noted which doors were locked and when, which servants were trusted with messages, which paths the overseer favored and which he avoided. He listened when others spoke in low voices, and he asked questions that sounded harmless enough to be ignored. People underestimated silence. They assumed it meant emptiness. His body bore the marks of the weeks past. The weight loss, the stiffness in his shoulders, the dull ache that never quite left. The breaking point had come and gone, not in a moment of collapse, but in a realization that pain was no longer the greatest threat. Staying was. The women escalated their efforts when their usual methods failed to provoke the reaction they wanted. Where once humiliation had been public, now it became intimate and insidious. They summoned him alone, one at a time, testing different approaches, different accusations. "You don't look at me the way you used to," one said, voice cool. "I look as I'm told," he answered. "That's not the same." No, it wasn't. And they hated that he understood the difference. Another accused him of spreading rumors, of turning servants against them, of listening too closely to conversations that did not concern him. Each lie was crafted to isolate him further, to cut off whatever fragile support still existed. But isolation had taught him something valuable: self-reliance. He stopped confiding, stopped reacting. He made himself small when necessary, invisible when possible. He learned when to speak and when silence would do more damage than words ever could. The overseer began to notice the tension, though he misunderstood its source. He saw the women's agitation and mistook it for cause rather than symptom. "You're becoming a problem," he told him one afternoon, leaning close enough that the threat carried weight. "I do my work," he replied steadily. "That may not be enough." It was never enough. The women's rivalry reached a point where they could no longer pretend unity. Their conversations grew sharp, their glances hostile. Servants whispered of arguments behind closed doors, of tears and raised voices. Control, once maintained through careful appearances, was beginning to crack, and cracks, he knew, let light in. One evening, as a storm rolled in and thunder shook the windows, he was called to the upper floor. The hallway was dim, lit only by the flicker of lamps. He could hear voices before he reached the door, angry, strained. "You're reckless," one said. "You're jealous," another snapped back. "He's not the issue," a third insisted. "We are." The words startled him, not because they were kind, but because they were honest. When the door opened, the room fell silent. 3 faces turned toward him, each wearing a different expression: anger, fear, something close to desperation. "Stand there," the mistress said, pointing. He stood. For a moment no one spoke. The storm outside filled the silence, rain lashing against glass. "You've caused division," she said finally. "I haven't," he replied quietly. "Don't lie." He met her gaze just briefly. "I didn't choose this." The admission hung between them, dangerous and undeniable. For an instant, he thought she might strike him for it. Instead, she looked away. What followed was not punishment in the usual sense. It was something colder, a tightening of his world, restrictions on where he could go, who he could speak to. He was watched more closely, followed more often. Trust, never abundant, evaporated entirely. They were afraid now, not of him as a man, but of what he represented, a loss of control they could not fully contain. At night, he planned. Not escape, not yet, but contingency. If this door closed, which window remained? If this ally turned away, who else might listen? He measured distances with his eyes, counted steps, memorized sounds. He also measured people. There were those who avoided him entirely, those who pitied him but could offer nothing, and a few, very few, who watched him with the same quiet awareness he felt in himself. One was an older man who worked near the stables. They never spoke of plans, never acknowledged more than necessity. But once, as they passed each other at dawn, the man paused just long enough to murmur, "Storms break things loose." It was not advice. It was observation. The breaking point came without spectacle. An accusation was made, another lie, delivered with practiced calm. It was one that could have ended everything if allowed to stand. He was brought before the overseer and the women together, the air heavy with expectation. "Explain yourself," the overseer demanded. He looked from one face to another, reading what they wanted to see: fear, confusion, pleading. Instead, he spoke carefully, not to deny but to question, not to accuse but to clarify. He pointed out contradictions without naming them as such. He asked for specifics, times, details. The women grew flustered. Their story faltered. It was not enough to save him, but it was enough to shift something. For the first time, doubt entered the room. Afterward, he was dismissed without punishment, a small mercy but a telling one. As he walked away, he felt the eyes on his back, not triumphant, not cruel, but uncertain. Uncertainty was power. That night, as he lay awake listening to the plantation settle into uneasy sleep, he understood the truth of his situation with a clarity that surprised him. He was standing at the edge of something. Not freedom yet, but the possibility of it. The women's control was no longer absolute. Their unity was fractured, their confidence shaken. The breaking point had passed. Now came the waiting, the patience, the careful movement toward whatever lay beyond the fences and the shadows. Outside, the storm had cleared. The air was cool, the world washed clean for a moment, and in that quiet, he allowed himself a single thought, held close and guarded. They are losing their grip, and I am still standing. The days after that uneasy confrontation settled into a strange, fragile calm. It was not peace, far from it, but a pause, the kind that comes when everyone involved senses that something has shifted and no one is quite sure how to respond. The women no longer summoned him with the same careless confidence. Their commands still came, but they were shorter, more precise, as though excess cruelty now carried risk. He noticed everything. He noticed how the mistress hesitated before giving orders, as if weighing whether they might later be questioned. He noticed how the youngest avoided being alone with him, her earlier boldness replaced by a tight, restless energy. He noticed how the sister watched the others more than she watched him, her attention turned inward, toward the fragile alliances holding them together. They had not stopped seeing him as property, but they had begun to understand that property could become evidence, so they adapted, and so did he. He made himself useful in ways that were impossible to criticize. He completed tasks early, quietly, without drawing attention. He anticipated needs without being asked, but never too often, never in a way that could be twisted into presumption. He was careful not to linger, careful not to seem eager. He let his presence fade, just enough to lower their guard. At the same time, he listened. Servants spoke freely around those they believed invisible. They complained in half-finished sentences, traded rumors as currency, whispered fears when the house grew quiet. He learned which doors were used at night, which trunks held letters, which visitors were expected and which were not. The plantation, once a maze of uncertainty, began to resolve into patterns. He learned that the women feared scandal above all else. That reputation, once damaged, could not be restored, not in their world. He learned that the overseer resented their influence even as he relied on it, that he would turn quickly if it served his position. He learned that there were eyes beyond the plantation watching more closely than they realized. This knowledge did not embolden him recklessly. It steadied him. He became careful in a new way, not shrinking but deliberate. Every movement was chosen, every word weighed. Survival had always required endurance, but now it required precision. The women noticed the change, though they misread its cause. "He's grown obedient," one said, suspicion laced through her voice. "Or cunning," another replied. "Don't imagine threats where there are none," the mistress said, though she did not sound convinced. Their uncertainty bred tension, and tension bred mistakes. They argued more openly now, their disagreements spilling into hallways and stairwells. Servants were dismissed abruptly, orders contradicted each other. Control, once carefully choreographed, slipped, and he stood at the center of it all, appearing passive, absorbing everything. One evening, as he carried linens through the upper floor, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "If word gets out, it won't," came the sharp reply. "You said that before." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with fear. That night he did not sleep, not from pain or anxiety, but from calculation. He replayed conversations, weighed risks, imagined outcomes. He thought about the fences, the woods beyond, the paths that led away from the plantation. He thought about the people who might help, and those who would betray him without hesitation. Most of all, he thought about timing. Resistance, he understood now, was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply refusing to be exactly where your oppressor expected you to be. The next weeks were a careful dance. He complied, but not blindly. He positioned himself near conversations, near documents left unattended, near doors that led to knowledge rather than escape. He asked questions framed as concern. He listened more than he spoke. The women, distracted by their own rivalries, failed to notice how much ground they were losing. There were moments when fear returned sharply, when accusations hovered just beneath the surface, when the overseer's gaze lingered too long. But he reminded himself of what he had already survived, of the breaking point he had passed, of the fact that endurance had carried him this far and intelligence would carry him further. One afternoon, the mistress confronted him unexpectedly. "You've been quiet," she said. "I've been working," he replied. "Yes," she said, guilt. Orion's guilt, fear. He gave her none of it. "You understand," she continued, "that everything here depends on order." "Yes, ma'am." "And that disorder invites consequences." He met her gaze briefly, then lowered his eyes. "I understand." What he understood she could not imagine. After she dismissed him, he felt a familiar tension ease slightly. The exchange had been a test. One she had failed. That evening, as the plantation settled into uneasy quiet, he stood outside for a moment longer than usual, breathing in the air beyond the house. The sky was clear, stars sharp against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. He was no longer just enduring the days, he was shaping them. The women still believed they controlled the narrative. They believed his silence meant submission, his obedience meant surrender. They could not see the slow erosion of their authority, the way their own fear had begun to guide his path forward. He knew the risks. One misstep could undo everything. One accusation, properly timed, could still destroy him. But he also knew this: staying passive was no longer the most dangerous choice. He had learned their weaknesses. He had learned his own strength. The resistance was quiet, nearly invisible. But it was real, and it was growing. As he returned to his quarters that night, he allowed himself a rare thing, a sense of purpose that did not depend on survival alone. Whatever came next, he would not face it blindly. The plantation had tried to reduce him to silence. Instead, it had taught him how to listen. And listening, he now knew, was the first step toward freedom. The moment did not arrive with thunder or chaos. There was no single spark that announced itself as the beginning of the end. Instead, it unfolded the way all carefully prepared things do, quietly, almost invisibly, carried forward by choices made long before anyone else realized their weight. By then, the plantation was already unsteady. The women moved through the house with strained politeness, their conversations clipped, their tempers quick to flare. Servants sensed it too. Instructions were repeated, then contradicted. Doors that were once left open were now shut. Trust, already thin, had worn through completely, and he was still there, still moving through their world like a shadow they could no longer quite control. He had learned when to be seen and when to disappear. He knew which corridors were watched and which were ignored, which hours of the night carried the least risk. He understood now that escape was not only about leaving, it was about ensuring that those left behind were too tangled in their own unraveling to follow. The women had begun to turn on one another openly. Accusations that once required his presence now existed without him. "You were careless," one hissed. "You're trying to blame me," another snapped back. "If this comes out, we all suffer." Their fear had sharpened into something desperate. He did not interfere. He did not provoke. He waited. The opportunity came disguised as routine. One evening, he was instructed to prepare the house for a small gathering. Nothing grand, just visitors important enough to require appearances. The mistress oversaw the preparations personally, her voice tight, her movements restless. "Everything must be perfect," she said. "Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Perfection, he knew, was impossible, and that impossibility was precisely what would undo them. As the house filled with guests, tension thickened the air. Conversations were polite, laughter forced. The women performed their roles with practiced grace, but cracks showed beneath the surface. A sharp word here, a too long glance there. Small things, easily overlooked, unless one knew where to look. He moved quietly among them, serving, observing, remembering. At one point, a guest asked a question, innocent on its face, but dangerous in its implications. The mistress answered too quickly. Her sister contradicted her without meaning to. A silence followed, brief but heavy. Eyes met. Doubt flickered. It was enough. He did nothing else. He did not speak, did not signal, did not accuse. He simply continued his work, knowing that once doubt took root, it did not require nurturing. It fed on fear, and there was plenty of that to go around. By the time the guests left, the women were shaken. Their unity, already fragile, had fractured further. That night, the house did not sleep. Voices rose behind closed doors. Footsteps paced. A door slammed hard enough to echo through the hall. Servants whispered, sensing that something had shifted irreversibly. And he made his choice. He did not leave immediately. He waited until the argument upstairs reached its peak, until attention turned fully inward. Then he moved, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate. He took nothing that could be traced. He followed paths he had memorized in fragments over months, stepping where the ground was firm, where sound would not carry. The fence was exactly where he expected it to be. The gap, exactly as he had measured. Beyond it, the world opened into darkness and possibility. He did not run. Running invited pursuit. He walked steadily into the trees, letting the plantation's lights fade behind him. Each step carried him further from the place that had tried to claim him, further from the eyes that had watched him not as a man, but as an object to be controlled. Behind him, the plantation imploded. By morning, rumors spread faster than truth ever had. Contradictions were noticed. Stories no longer aligned. The overseer, sensing danger, distanced himself. The women, once so confident in their authority, found themselves isolated, their words questioned, their reputations fraying. No one spoke his name. They did not need to. His absence said everything. Days passed. Then weeks. Search parties were half-hearted, poorly coordinated. Fear had replaced certainty, and no one wanted to look too closely at what might be found, either in the woods or in their own past actions. Eventually, the search stopped. Some said he had died in the wilderness. Others claimed he had been taken in by people who understood silence as well as he did. Stories grew, shifted, contradicted one another. Truth became just another thing no one could quite agree on. Far from the plantation, moving carefully through unfamiliar land, he learned a new rhythm. One shaped not by bells or commands, but by choice, by listening, by watching the world not as a trap, but as something wide and unfinished. He carried scars with him, some visible, many not. He carried memory. He carried the knowledge of what power looked like when it was threatened, how cruelty collapsed when exposed to its own reflection. He did not seek revenge. Survival had taught him something deeper than that. The greatest refusal was to live beyond their reach, beyond their narrative. Some nights, as he rested beneath open sky, he thought of the plantation, not with longing, but with clarity. It had tried to break him by defining him. By deciding who he was allowed to be, it had failed, because in the end they had mistaken endurance for weakness, silence for surrender, beauty for possession, and they had never understood the most dangerous truth of all, that the man they tried to control had been watching them just as closely, and when the moment came, he had simply walked away, leaving them with nothing but their fear, their unraveling stories, and the quiet knowledge that the one thing they could not reclaim was their certainty. He was gone. And for the first time in his life, the future belonged to him alone.